There is a challenge that is coming from digital currencies such as blockchain technologies.
So I think it's important to share that anything can be tokenized.
All the money.
I like the idea of a gold standard. I mean, it could be used in a very cryptocurrency way.
Very much sooner than a lot of people understand or think. We will be all at a level playing field.
Hey, welcome to the show. I have a wonderful guest with me today, Mr. Clinton Bryan. Nice to see you, Clinton. How's it going?
Good. Thank you for having me, Molly. It's my absolute pleasure.
Awesome. So we're going to have a really cool discussion around blockchain and the applications in the business world. But before we get into that stuff, we might have some people watching it who have not met you before. So catch us up. What's Clinton's story and how did it get you to this place where you are an expert in the blockchain for business world?
Clinton's story is that I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey.
Okay.
Left Paterson, New Jersey at a very young age, at 17 going on 18, and I joined the U.S. Navy Seabees. And travel the world. They've often said, join the military, travel the world. And I've known about probably 85% of the people that probably never really traveled the world per se in the context of which I have. So
Okay.
I've been truly blessed and fortunate to have, lived that life as it relates to, pursuing that goal and dream and fulfilling it by living in 23 countries or so.
Where have
Uh,
you been or visited or lived that was most impactful to you?
there are several places actually, to be honest with you. So my first deployment was in 1996 in Okinawa, Japan, which was very eye-opening and enlightening. At 18, you've never left home, mom and dad, growing up a little bit sheltered, and going into a new foreign space, and you get to go out and you do things that, you don't typically do as an 18-year-old in America. You get to do it 18 and 19 in other countries. I would say Greece. I lived there on the island of Crete for 2 years. It was very impactful. I got to see the European theater. And then I think one of the most significant, impactful leadership moment of growth for me was doing a combat tour in Iraq, doing nighttime operations, convoy, tactical mobility team. And yeah, Australia was awesome. I went there with the U.S. Navy dive team. So I've done a lot of real fun stuff. Jungle warfare in Japan, so I've really truly lived a life that I hope people that I encounter get to experience at least 1% thereof.
Okay.
Yeah, so after the military, actually not post-military, but while in the military, I started pursuing my college degree because again, leaving out of high school, that was the option. It was either I didn't military or college, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I figured the military was an option. So I, capitalized on using a thing called a tuition assistance program, where
Okay.
you basically get free money while on active duty to attend school. I got my understudies or like associate's degree in electromechanical engineering.
Is
My
that different than
background,
the GI Bill?
it is very different than the GI Bill, and I'll get to that here shortly. So while you're on active duty, you can actually capitalize on a thing called tuition assistance. So I was smart enough to do that and started using some of my GI Bill, and used my GI Bill, got my honor studies completed out in California, actually, Brandman University. I think they've changed now to like UMass Global or something. Um, and then, I actually got accepted to law school, believe it or not, but I decided not to because I had other things to work on. So my wife is currently in law school. We met while on active duty in the military. And yeah, it's just been a fun-filled ride so far. That being said, cryptocurrency came along, and I missed the boat initially, and here's the reason why, and this will make sense to you here shortly. So I went to Greece on the island of Crete back in 2008 to 2010, and the economical collapse occurred in 2008. Bitcoin came out in 2009, and I came back in 2010. Typically, I consider myself a person trendy in a sense as it relates to technology. So I was busy in Greece, spending a euro. The economy was great there, and just partying and traveling throughout the European theater. So I missed that is what I'm getting at. I missed the whole entire crypto, and again, Bitcoin was created to offset inflation and so forth, right? What a perfect timing right after an economical collapse. And a lot of people don't realize the macro as it ties into that because that's not something you conjure up or build overnight, right? A year thereafter, if that makes any sense, Molly. So again, that's we'll go into that here in our further discussions, but that's kind of how I look at it looking backwards. So I got back in 2010, went on about life while still being on active duty. And, I started realizing there was a thing called cryptocurrency and blockchains. And I was like, wow, this is interesting. So 2014, I started getting into it. So I got into space relatively early. A lot of tokens or coins per se, depending on if they were minted on their proprietary blockchain or a spin-off or iteration thereof, they become tokens. And I started investing. And it became like just a thing of beauty for me, personally speaking. Because to your point earlier, I believe in the macro. From living in 23 countries and I think visiting up to 54 now. Understanding geopolitics, understanding G to G, understanding just the economy as it relates to anything. And, actually my background in formal education is in business. So it's all relatable, if that makes any sense. So going from there, I just picked it up and I started investing, and I had a group of good friends that were already in the space, and we started having different private chats and forums and so forth. And it was, I would say, on up until 2 years thereafter, 2016, when I really started becoming really serious about cryptocurrency and blockchain.
Okay.
And, a lot of due diligence, starting to read white papers and so forth, and just kind of having a true understanding of the underlying mechanics and construct of why these systems were put into place, especially the other blockchains that came after Bitcoin, such as Ripple, Stellar, and so forth. And yeah, so I mean, it just it became a thing of interest. And I would say 2017 is when I really, really started delving in and seeing the rewards of my due diligence and patience and investing. And that scale and grew. We went through a couple of market cycles, the bear market, as they say, when the market's volatile and it goes down, to the our crypto winters, as they call it, to coming out of it in 2019 and 2020. And friends started reaching out and saying, oh, I should have listened to you in 2017. And I said, you know what, it's not too late. And I have a really close friend actually that I served with. We actually went to boot camp together 29 years ago. And he reached out to me and he's like, man, I missed the boat. And I said, no, dude, here's a portfolio that I'll put together for you based on, just complete use case, real world use case, future projections per se, and adoption, because obviously during that time it was the Wild West. There was no regulations. We're kind of still struggling through that right now. But yeah, I mean, he literally called me, I'd say 6 weeks ago, 5, 6 weeks ago. And he stated to me, he reminded me in specific dates. Actually, it's interesting, December 27th, which is today, 4 years ago to this day, but this was 6 weeks ago when he said, hey, remember when you told me you wanted to be a millionaire? Um, and you wanted me to be one as well because I was so deserving. And he was kind of choking back on his words. And then he just kind of blurted out and he said, I want to thank you so much, brother. You've changed the course of my entire life, my family's life. He said, I became a millionaire today. And that's when the market rallied 5, 6 weeks ago, from
Okay.
investing in, yeah, and doubling down and tripling down on the ISO 222 tokens. And basically what they are, it's basically an industry standard, any kind of ISO, where there's talks that's been made that they're going to be tied into the institution as well as the banking infrastructure for the new monetary rail system to kind of either supplement, integrate, or replace the SWIFT system that came about in 1973, which actually became live in 1977, the year I was born. And now it's a very antiquated system. When you send money across borders, even nationally, it takes 1 to 3 days. Swift does $5 trillion a day in transaction. So now the ISO standard or banking communication system is getting ready to replace that. So again, just excited about knowing about those elements by going to the sources, the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, where they have papers and they've been rolling out these different beta programs. It's been a thing of beauty to have the insight thereof and kind of shutting out the noise as it relates to the rest of the world and kind of focusing in on where cryptocurrency is and where it's going to go. But yeah, so far, beyond my one friend, I had a second person follow up the second day to tell me the same thing, that they became a seven-figure earner through cryptocurrencies. And during that same week, three other friends told me they were able to fully retire. So it was very, very awesome to kind of get that insight. And I may have actually skipped some things and ran along instead of just doing the introduction on the macro. But that's what got me here was just the passion and drive and the understanding of, doing credible research, for lack of a better term, to get some insights as it relates to the changing world.
So there are a lot of people who are not familiar with the crypto or digital asset space who sort of see it simply as like a parallel path of stocks where you kind of invest early and then something goes up in value and you kind of cash out and then there's this like return on investment. However, many of us, and I'm assuming you do because you have a book about blockchain for business, understand there's a lot of applications that aren't really just about like a get rich quick type thing. So
Mhm.
as you were, traveling the world back in the 08, 09 era with the global financial crisis, you mentioned that that was kind of when you first started to learn about blockchain. Like, how would you describe the problem that blockchain solves that you were able to see early on as kind of a visionary?
I would definitely say one of the issues that I saw it solving is the bottlenecking for just the banks and how we transact. And it's
Okay.
relatively interesting because if you think about it, or if people think about it, we went from having coins and dollars in our lifetime, in our pockets, our parents' lifetime, even our lifetime, where you would carry cash around. Some people still do to this day. And it's rather relatively interesting because today, a majority of people either have a smart device or a piece of plastic. They don't see the infrastructure in place, but it exists, right? But there's still a lot of bottlenecking issues as it relates to my point earlier with sending money from account to account, and there's delays there, whether it's either 1 to 3 days. And as it relates to blockchain and cryptocurrency, it makes that bottlenecking and that delay time almost instantaneous at a fraction of the cost. That being said, I've also sat on the board of several companies as well, blockchain companies, blockchain crypto companies in an executive capacity to write their white paper, develop the tokenomics, which I didn't touch on. I actually skipped over that. And one such project, it's called BoostCoin. Right now, it's been 2 years. I've kind of stepped away from it for a while to pursue other things. But BoostCoin was a very novelty project where the owner has $100 million AUM across 5 continents in the fine wine and rare spirits industry. He conceptualized this idea of, oh, hey, I want to create a coin on the Solana blockchain. I'm like, oh, that's a great idea. But I'm like, okay, you got to go beyond that. You have to scale, right? Like you have a great industry, you already have a standalone existing business where now you can implement and integrate data, right? So what they're currently working on is building out a back-end infrastructure of 25 years of supply chain data and algorithm to implement in their back end. I don't know where you're from, Molly, but I lived in California for a while where there's a place called Bevmo, Beverages and More. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of it.
The liquor store?
Exactly, yeah. So what he's doing, they're trying to do is like bring that concept to where if you plug in on the front end through a web portal or a Web3 wallet integration, you can find the fine wines and rare spirits that you couldn't typically find in your local store per se.
Okay.
And having the metrics and the data to actually find and locate that through geolocation as an implementation in the back end, right? They're working through the legal aspect because obviously here in the States, you can't really traffic alcohol across state line and so forth. So they're working through the mechanics there. But the idea and the concept is like, how great is that to your earlier question about solving a problem? If people, we're talking about a $1.5 trillion industry. And if you want to get something that's not unique or niche to your area, if you're a wine connoisseur or spirit connoisseur, you'd have access to Bordeaux or somewhere like that. You'd fly there, or you go somewhere you can't find it. But now they're putting together a blockchain to where it could be readily available to you on a state level, right? As they work through the macro on a nationwide level and so forth. But yeah, and that was a 3 year ago project that I'd put together as the chief visionary officer, amongst other projects that I've worked on as well too. And interestingly enough, I find myself and consider myself to be a nerd as well. So I've written 2 tokens on a blockchain, one on the Ethereum and one on the Waves exchange. And this was 4 years ago, and I actually call it the Clinton Bryan quantum token. And this was a utility token. And nobody was really talking about quantum or utility 4 years ago, right?
Right.
So to your point about the visionary, it's the actual execution piece that's the toughest part. It's finding the developers and so forth. But yeah, to end the short version to your question, it was one of the things that I saw to be a relative fix to a lot of existing issues in the world, just on those two examples.
So most of the work that I've done around XRP has been related to the sort of payment system and how money gets moved and store of value, reserve currencies, that type of thing. But obviously there's this world of business where businesses have problems that are best solved in some cases by a more efficient technology. I mean, we saw
Yes.
how the internet and websites, for example, completely transformed, the commerce side, and e-commerce, is such a prevalent way for people to buy products and services now, where 20 years ago, it was difficult to imagine the scale and the scope that which the business community would embrace websites. So
Mhm.
let's talk a little bit about what's in your book, Blockchain for Business. Like, what are some examples of specific sectors that are struggling with either like too much middleman problems or some other inefficiency that you think blockchain technology can help solve?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It covers a lot of sectors, and I would say with regards to healthcare, it's having a system that's immutable, meaning that once it's created, it cannot be destroyed like record keeping. You talk about security, so those are the two things that comes to mind as it
Is that a
relates to
problem in
that.
healthcare, or like records disappearing or being destroyed or
Uh,
changed?
yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. I
Is
would
it from
say
like ill intent or is it just
I'd
error?
probably, I can't speak on the behalf of the ill intent, but it's the
Okay.
human element with that regard. Someone actually going in, scanning in documents. I remember leaving the military or being in the military, having a microfiche. And what a microfiche is basically your data. A human being had to go in to actually do that, right? And who's to say a mistake isn't made or due diligence? But again, there's the other side to it as well, with the military called a TPI, two-person integrity where someone's overseeing or checking someone else's work.
Okay.
And that's a more secure, I would say, infrastructure. But of course, the problem remains is like data being damaged or a database being localized to an infrastructure. Whereas on the blockchain, if it's created, it can't be destroyed. And that's the beauty about it, right? So that's another problem being solved as far as the record keeping goes. One of the things that I wrote about in the book as well too, Molly, was about the governments, right? Like
Okay.
one of the things that we've had in the last several years is the voting system, right? There's been opposition against voter ID and accountability. You see people on the ballot that have been deceased and so forth. So the idea and the intent is that you'd have, and I don't want to go on the concept of a CBDC because again, there's two separate ideology of a CBDC, right? Because we want kind of like autonomy. And anonymity as it relates to our privacy. And
Mhm.
then you have the other part where they talk about this social credit system, which a lot of people are in opposition against. That being said, though, what I wrote about specifically is that you would have I don't want to call it a digital ID, but some kind of system where you can go and qualify and validate yourself as an individual, where someone couldn't come in to step in to replicate that process so you could be accounted for immutably, right? Where you created, you stand alone. You can't whether it's some kind of Face ID thumbprint, but whatever it takes to create a system of accountability, transparency, security, which I truly think that the voting system is missing, if that makes any sense. So that's another problem
Okay.
that can be solved. Supply chain's another issue that I wrote about in the book.
Okay.
I mean, if you talk about point of origin to final destination, that could be a great tracking system through like blockchain integration of IoT, the Internet of Things, meaning
Mhm.
that some kind of tracking device, but you can track it in real time across the globe as well. So that's another piece that I touched on. Touched on law. Like I said,
Go back to
I
supply chain for a second. Hold on. So do
yeah.
you see that the trade finance world will use blockchain technology to kind of more efficiently move value?
I do. And again, it creates that chain of custody, for lack of a better term, from point A to point B to Z and back up, down, left and right, right? Because again, it's about accountability to me. We live by that every day in the military. honor, courage, and commitment. And unfortunately, the rest of the world doesn't live by those core principles. So you kind of have to have those things in place for the traditional financial system. I mean, let's go back to September 10th, 2001, right? Everybody remembers September 11th, but what was said on September 10th when
Where's the
Donald
gold?
Rumsfeld came on? Say again.
Where's the gold? There was the discussion on the 10th about the missing gold, but
Right. And then you talk about, wars being in play and then money being sent over to X country. And again, how do you account for that is the point, right? As an American citizen taxpayer, how do you account for that? Speaking of taxpayers, that's another element. I'd say about 6, 7 years ago, I came up with an idea, some concept saying a Tax Accountability Act, where I look at it inversely, where anyone could be audited by the IRS at any given point. But how does the pendulum swing in the other direction, where if you wanted an account for, hey, I paid X amount of dollars in taxes. I noticed that my roads aren't being fixed on a state level. I know that X isn't being done on a G level. So how does that work? How do we hold people accountable in a sense without physically going there, right? Wouldn't it be beautiful if you had, like, just like you have a social security number that tracks and monitors the income and so forth? Wouldn't it be a thing of beauty if you could log into a G website and plug your system information in, and you're like, oh, well, you paid X amount of dollars. We can account that 5,000 went here, 10,000 went there, right? Wouldn't you, I think you would feel somewhat relieved knowing that your efforts actually count, right? If that makes sense.
sure. I mean, one of the fascinating things that came out of the FTX scandal, in my opinion, was it showed this paper trail of money from the US government to Zelensky. Zelensky deposits it in FTX. And all of a
Yep.
sudden, Sam Bankman-Fried, who was an instant billionaire, seems to become the largest campaign donor in history and is giving all this money to all these politicians. Well, where did he get that money? I mean, FTX wasn't really that profitable necessarily in terms of actually doing a service. So do you think that the government will open up and use sort of blockchain or digital asset currencies that are transparent for government spending?
I do, especially with the new DOGE department,
Okay.
Department of Government Efficiency. I really believe with the people that are in place and the new administration, they're all about accountability. And I thrive and I live for accountability. And I truly hope so, Molly, that they do implement and apply and build the infrastructure. Obviously, there's a lot of upgrades that need to occur, from, the simple computer infrastructures to the entire system. I think if they made the entire government blockchain capable, it would be absolutely incredible because it's all about accountability, right?
And I dislike immensely hypocrisy and double standards. And there's
Yes.
been a set of rules that we have to be very transparent about all the money we earn and making sure we pay all these taxes, but we have zero idea where the money that we contribute actually goes. Like the budget is not the same as an audit of here's where the money actually went.
Yeah, I mean, how do you not account for billions of dollars? That's a problem. That's a significant problem because you know what? Like I said, coming from the military, I have a place in my heart for every American, bottom line, but even more so for homeless veterans. And that's a big problem that needs to be solved. And when you're talking about billions of dollars being now accounted for, you could reallocate those capital for these programs that everybody talks about fixing and nothing ever happens to them.
Agreed. I mean, would be such a significant thing to witness in our lifetime, government spending actually being transparent, because you realize so much of it's being stolen. So on a less cynical thing, I want to go back to supply chain again, because I think the supply chain is a fascinating thing in this global era that we live in. And you've been probably to more ports in sort of faraway places than I've been. My understanding is many of them use very antiquated technology, if you could even call it technology at all, like papers that are signed and passed off. So if you think about the idea of the supply chain moving to the blockchain, like what would be required, like logistically or infrastructure wise, for all of these ports in kind of more third world places to be able to use this technology? Is that a big deal, or is it just going to be done in someone's smartphone and I'm making a mountain out of a molehill?
So it's interesting to that point. And so for the record, really quickly, so being in the Navy, I was a Navy Seabee, which is a naval construction force. So I never necessarily was stationed on a ship. I flew
Okay.
wherever we went to.
Okay.
Um, Yeah, but to your point, I'm familiar with some ports because I've gone to some ports. But as it relates to that, I do believe that systems are being put in place because if you look at it, realistically speaking, Starlink satellites, right? So if you look at that as the new internet infrastructure, now
Okay.
you have the communication systems already out there, and all you need to do is build some kind of blockchain with zero latency to communicate as a repeater system to communicate and tie all the information or message traffic in together across the different landscapes to include those third world countries, if that makes sense.
And UPS has been tracking their packages pretty accurately for
Yes,
quite some time. So just leveraging that type of tracking
exactly.
technology maybe isn't that big a deal.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So that's how I see it is the infrastructures are going in places that are capable to connect the communication process.
Now, do you think that will be an evolutionary process? Like it's going to take a while for all of these ports to go on? Or is it going to be more of a flip the switch scenario, in your opinion, where it all just kind of goes online at once?
Well, I mean, it takes times to build things, right? And again, I feel like it could well, I digress. There could be a flip the switch moment.
Okay.
Because again, if you already have the communication satellites in place, you already have the existing blockchain infrastructure. I mean, if you look at Ripple, they're doing such an amazing job with cross-border payments. And I mean, it's a blockchain that you could build upon, meaning that if you wanted to do supply chain, you could probably build a supply chain infrastructure off of that existing blockchain. And then you already have the communication infrastructure. So yeah, I definitely think if developers are already working on these IPs or intellectual properties as it relates to, the items outlined in my book, I do believe that those pioneers are already working on that. And speaking of which, actually, I have a really great friend of mine. She's a retired teacher,
Okay.
and she bought my book, Blockchains for Businesses, and she's done so many businesses outside of teaching as an entrepreneur. Um, and it's interesting because she's revisited every one of her projects that she's done in the past, and she's refined all 10 of her projects to be blockchain compatible and compliant.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are some
Within
examples? Like, let's talk about some other sectors and industries that are going to benefit from blockchain technology efficiency.
Oh yeah, I mean any industry. Like for her, she's into yachts, mega yachts, and so forth. So
Oh,
she's
okay.
yeah, yeah. So and so I confer with her. I'm kind of like her silent business partner.
Okay.
So she has access to people, chefs, operators, owner, builders, and so I was saying, hey, let's get very creative about this. Like say if you wanted to build X yacht, let's either record or get the wireframe or the 3D model, and you can tokenize that, right? You can tokenize that for fractional ownership and kind of like not necessarily what the Bored Ape Yacht Clubs are doing for access. This is more so ownership of a yacht or
Okay.
leasing or renting or like you would use for a timeshare, right?
Right.
Like so you're an early investor, you bought a wireframe or the picture or whatever it is, however you want to tokenize it, but that tokenization gives you access to that yacht, right? And it's the same to your point about the ports. It's the same thing. It's making those ports more infrastructure ready, more clean. You talk about the ESG aspect, putting the ESG, the carbon credits on the blockchain as well, the environmental social governance, the ESG that everybody's talking about today. So you can leverage your renewable energy for cost savings, turn that into carbon credit, resell that. I mean, there's so many things you could do with it. Again, it's just so much to do with it because again, I'm a very visual person. So as she's talking about it, I'm conceptualizing it, if that
Okay.
makes any sense. So that's another portion of how blockchain could actually help. So it's not just necessarily software with nodes on a standalone or multiple computer. It's like real world, tangible um, things that you can account for and tokenizing them and leveraging those for potential capital or to truly do good by humanity in the world, if that makes sense.
I want to switch gears a little bit for a second and go back to
No
some more
problem.
geopolitical things. Just because you're
Yes.
a Navy guy, I want some like insider info on my next question. So
Mhm.
it's since the petrodollar agreement in the early 70s, where you could argue that the dollar has been backed by oil for most of our lifetime. Part of that agreement was that the US Navy was going to be sort of the cop to protect the global supply chain. And, pirates aren't allowed to steal oil tankers, otherwise, the US Navy will come and cause some problems for them. So, do you think we're shifting away from the petrodollar to a less like US centric model? And if so, like, what is that going to mean for the Navy and people moving goods and services or products around on the oceans?
That's a really great question because to your point, right? 1971, when Nixon removed the gold standard from the dollar and kind of pegged everything across the planet to the US dollar, right? And the creation of the petrodollar as well. There's been a significant imbalance as it relates to just war in general with the sanctions. And I do believe that there may be some like a level playing field, for lack of a better term, where you're going to now have blockchain, you're going to have maybe a reevaluation per se, across all sectors to kind of make it more favorable for the world to be a better place. I do see oil being a commodity, not necessarily going away, but I do see a more balanced, unified front. Obviously, there's the BRICS nations, but there's been, it's interesting about that, to your point about the military aspect, because there's been a lot of cross-functional military training exercise where we actually partner with people in the BRICS countries. As
Okay.
contradictory as that may seem, right? You're like, oh, what do you mean? Like we partner with and do exercises with BRICS, nations within the BRICS, and it's like, yeah, we do. But to your point, I do see us, it being a more level playing field where we have actual assets, maybe gold, silver, commodities being leveraged to be backed, backing the currency and moving to a more digital infrastructure, if that makes any sense to your point. Does that answer your
I
question?
guess I'm just curious if you think the role of the US military specifically is going to
For the oil?
change.
Yeah, like I said, I don't believe that role will ever change, but I do believe there may be some easement, like a little bit of easement there based on, the statement just now of a more level playing field where I don't think the inevitable greed that's been there all these years may still be there. And that's my hope. I truly hope for that.
I'm very fond of the level playing field thesis and covered it for a couple of years now. So I'm
Yes.
happy to hear you say that.
Yeah.
All right. So you've been in the crypto world for a long time, which means that when you kind of first started, Bitcoin was like the king of cryptos, right? So do you think the identity of Satoshi Nakamoto is relevant?
Um, there's been a lot of play on where the initial IP address came from. It was the same IP address for XRP. There's been statements that it's not just one person. There was a four-person team, which are inclusive of the XRP, XLM, our Stellar community developers. So there's a lot of words going around. Is it relevant? Oh, it depends on the perspective, right? Because you're talking about someone with 1 million XRP, $1 trillion worth of money. That person could significantly destroy and disrupt that entire ecosystem. Depends on the perspective, right?
Right. Now, I don't come from the world of institutional finance, so I've learned most of this from people like Jimmy. But when
Yeah.
you are a BlackRock, for example, and
Oh,
you're
for
going to
sure.
launch like an ETF
Mhm.
that covers a single asset like XR, Bitcoin,
Yeah.
he believes that BlackRock and others in that same space have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors, or the people whose assets they are managing,
Yeah.
to know the identity. So how do you think the BlackRocks and the grayscales of the world are getting around that fiduciary responsibility issue with Satoshi?
Well, I mean, like I said, there's been a lot of different rumors out there, and maybe they know.
Maybe they.
Maybe they know. Maybe who knows? Maybe they know. And to my point, my earlier point, maybe those four are. I mean, there are NDAs, there are things called, like a function of national security, right? You talk about the NSA, who wrote a white paper years before Bitcoin, I think in 1986 or something like that. I mean,
Oh, David Schwartz's patent from the 80s?
there's so many different iterations of who that person or group of people are. But to your point, I think it matters in the context of protecting the interest of people as it relates to what now? I think it's 2 point something trillion dollars or three, no, 3 point something trillion dollars in the crypto market. I mean, you talk about chopping the legs from underneath that, it could disrupt a lot of things to kill investors' confidence, right? I mean, right now, to your point, I'm glad we're on the point of Bitcoin, because if you look at MICA markets and crypto assets that's coming into Europe on the 31st, there's been talks about delisting Tether, and we know Tether could potentially be a ticking time bomb, is it's got a ton of liquidity propped up into Bitcoin. That's just one element, right?
Mhm.
And again, about the fiduciary responsibility, there are people behind that, right? So again, I try to lean on the side of greater good to try to think for the best interest of humanity. I
Mhm.
think it's important, and I do believe it's irrelevant. I think the mystery shrouded around Satoshi Nakamoto is super awesome, especially after all these years. And that wallet's just been sitting there the whole time and nothing. Because think about that. I think that shows a lot of um, a good side to the element of not rugging the system for so
Well, it
long.
was four people and one of them died and you needed all four signatures,
Yeah.
then, it's kind of like lost value potentially.
Well, and more security though.
True.
Now you remove the element if there was a forced signature do anything nefarious as well too. Not that I want anybody to die out of the four to my point.
I know
But
there, I mean, I've had this conversation now for years about if there are four, who are the four?
yeah.
And it's believed that one of the four was Hal Finney and he's
Yeah,
passed.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
he obviously can't sign on his
Yeah.
multi-sig thing. So
Signature, yeah.
it's just always fun to talk about this. Now, Bitcoin maxis, like they get a little defensive and like don't want to talk about this topic. Like I would love to see Michael Saylor address this publicly. I mean, he's betting the farm on Bitcoin, and every time this topic comes up, he seems to change it pretty quickly. So
It's interesting. And here's my take on blockchain, cryptocurrency technology on and maxis in any sector for that matter. We're all in it for the change. Why choose any one particular side? It's all the same thing, right? Like if you think about it holistically, right? Like, but to your point, you come across people that get so bent around the axle and emotionally just, "Arr, there's only one." Arr." Like, okay, there are many, and there are utility to be had within these blockchain ecosystems.
the um the passion of the tribalism of crypto reminds me of like college football tribalism,
Yes.
where like you'll literally beat someone else up because they like support
Yeah.
a team that you don't like or whatever.
Yeah.
It's that same level of like emotional intensity, which if you've studied any kind of psychology, like you don't really make great decisions when you're all fired up like that, right?
Yeah.
So it almost keeps people from having more rational conversations
And
sometimes.
to the contrary of that point, right? The emotional intensity, people need to be a little bit more emotionally intelligent so they could look at the macro holistically. That what is this trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish? Right? Because it's kind of been one-sided for a very long time. Like I said, the removal of the gold standard, taxation, just all these things, the wars, you know, uh, no accountability for different things. I mean, this is what this ecosystem was built for, is to bring all those things back to make us all cohesive, more secure, more transparent, more accountable. So that's kind of what I look towards when I think about blockchain and cryptocurrencies. I don't pick any one side per se, especially if it's something that's a store of value or have real world use case utility,
Mhm.
then it's a thing of beauty. It's plenty of room to partake and participate.
Great. All right, so we're coming up to the end of 2024. It was quite a volatile year in many ways, certainly in the world of politics. We
Yeah.
had a big election this year. What are some of your predictions for what we can expect to see in 2025 regarding blockchain technology and legislation, all that type of thing?
Yeah. So as it relates to there, obviously you saw President-elect Trump at the Bitcoin conference, talking about the day ones and so forth, regulatory clarity, regulation, which is what we need. You're talking about MiCA and SEPA, which is another European regulation
Tell people
to,
what those are if they're not familiar.
So MiCA is the market in crypto assets. Basically, it's a stablecoin regulation where
Okay.
if you state that, oh, I'm a stablecoin, okay, well, can you show me your books or your balance? What's backing it? How are you minting these? What qualifies it to be a stablecoin? Is it a possibility of being depegged? And so forth. I can't remember off the top of my head what SEPA means, but it's another regulatory framework in Europe
Okay.
that basically regulates the cryptocurrency market as it relates to being qualified per se.
You think we'll see similar regulations in the United States?
100%. And here's where I was going with that, with the SEPA and the MiCA. We have the ISO 222 standards coming in for the banking institution or institutional, where that goes live in March of 2025. And then the end date is November 2025 as well. So I see a lot of regulations being formed around that time frame.
Okay.
And probably a lot of these cryptocurrencies that are in existence may not exist anymore, which is kind of good in a sense, right? Now you talk about liquidity that's being stored and stockpiled in other currencies with no utility or use case being moved or pushed over into the real world utility tokens. So that's what I look forward to. Regards to 2025 is more regulations as it relates to creating a good holistic framework for the betterment of crypto and blockchain. So we don't have that obscure thought. People won't have that obscure thought of not knowing what it is because I still have conversations to this day, even with family and friends, after being in the space since 2014, written books. Like I said, stood on companies, and you're like, "Oh, what's this? It's still a speculative asset." Like, so that's what I look forward to 2025 is a more stable framework, a more stable ecosystem, and more liquidity. We're talking about trillions of dollars getting ready to flow through these the monetary rail systems as it relates to cryptocurrencies and blockchain.
Do you think so? I was around for the dot-com boom. I worked in the industry at the time, and it would have been impossible to convince someone that like Uber would be a thing or that people would buy shoes on the internet. So
Or
what are some of,
Airbnb, right?
yeah, and now those are kind of just taken for granted. So
Yeah.
what do you think are some of the big kind of changes to life as we know it that blockchain technology will introduce that people right now are going to have a hard time believing?
I would say like some examples that I used earlier with like the banking system, maybe it's just literally just a mobile device going forward and not is a million debit cards per se, right? You have maybe one standalone debit card that is interoperable,
Okay.
ties in between different banks. Now you have one card for multiple accounts. I mean, that would be
Oh,
phenomenal,
wow. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Think about that. Like that in itself is a concept, one device or one, peripheral, for lack of a better term, that you can easily access across multiple sectors. I would also say just any business just being put on the blockchain. To your point about Uber, like I said, with my friend building yachts, to where yacht is just a not just a thing for just the rich and famous, but if you're an investor or someone that bought an NFT and you can have access to a multi-million dollar yacht for leasing like I said the word earlier, as timeshare.
Right.
Think about that. A yacht is a timeshare.
Exactly.
How, how cool would that be?
Very
So
cool.
I think, just those simple concepts, amongst so much more, um, would be absolutely incredible.
If people want to learn more about your beliefs regarding blockchain and business, where can they get a copy of your book?
So they could go to Amazon and look my name up, Clinton Bryan.
Okay.
This is actually my sixth publishing, across different sectors, believe it or not.
Okay.
And I co-authored a few books with my wife that, became Amazon bestsellers as it relates to crypto, blockchain, programming, and the beauty about this book is that it takes you from the concept and the history of cryptocurrencies and blockchain, all the way to the very back. I added a bonus section that if you're an existing standalone business or an entrepreneur, you
Mhm.
could take this book and literally it walks you through step by step in that bonus section on how to bring your existing business or an idea onto the blockchain. So, but yeah, Amazon.com or I have a website as well too. It's called CB Consulting LLC.com. and you could go there to get a little bit more insights to those services that I offer as well as a consultant. So yeah, it's great things. We're at a very pivotal time in humanity that I don't believe we'll ever encounter ever again going forward in probably hundreds, if not thousands of years, with this new revolution, as they call it, the fourth industrial revolution. And it truly is bringing everything back in order to where it needs to be, especially with transparency, security, and accountability.
And are you active on any social media platforms in case people want to follow you for more?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter as well, but I'm not too active there. I'm on Thread and I'm on Instagram, Clinton Bryan. I
Okay.
just try to keep it simple. Or Clinton_G Bryan, as you could tell there with the G.
Okay.
So yeah.
Well, Clinton, it was wonderful chatting with you. Thank you very much. We covered a couple of very cool topics, and it's going to be exciting to see how this all develops and plays out next year.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Molly. It's an absolute pleasure. And I tell you what, I'm a huge fan of yours, and I've been following you for years as far as it goes to all your valuation. I've been following Jimmy as well for years. So yeah, it's kind of really neat to see things come full circle with like-minded people trying to change the world and educate people. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Mhm.
Take care.
You as well.